Morning, everybody, and I'd like to I'll reconvene the hearing panel for our second day of deliberations on the submissions. I'd like to welcome those who are watching through the live stream process. We have a list of submissions today that we didn't manage to get through yesterday, and we will discuss those. I'll just read those off in the order that they're going to be considered. Alliance Group, Kia Ora, Kiwi Rail, New Zealand Defence Force, New Zealand Transport Agency, Silver Fern Farms, and the telecommunication companies who submitted as a group. Just like to say that the panel has received the written submissions. We have read and considered them, and now we have an opportunity to discuss any questions that the panel may have arising out of those submissions, and we would address those questions to the reporting officer. I don't have any questions regarding Alliance Group, who appear to be in most part satisfied with recommendations of the 42A report. Does anyone else have any questions?
No, thank you. No.
Okay, moving on to Kia Ora. And Kia Ora generally support the recommendations in the 42A report as well. So I don't have any questions regarding that submission. Others may have some questions. It appears not. The next one is Kiwi Rail. Kiwi Rail also did not wish to be heard, but are available if we do want any more information. I think there was some consideration of reverse sensitivity there, but I have got no questions about their submission, because they're also satisfied mostly with the content of the 42A report. Anyone else have any questions as a result of those that submission?
I do, but it's also a question in terms of the Section 42A report and the way that the recommendation on UDF Objective 1 is worded, and I'll deal with that when we question Matt.
Okay, something for Matt to look forward to. New Zealand Defence Force. Paragraph 2.1, the Section 42A report cites the non-complying default activity status as consistent with the current best practice. I have no questions, further questions emanating out of this submission by the Defence Force. Anybody else?
We have indicated yesterday that we'll be seeking further submission, in the right of reply from the reporting planner on this issue, and more detail of what's in the Wellington City Council plan.
Thank you, Keith. Right. Would we deal with that now or wait till Matt has a wrap up at the end of this?
We'll deal with it later.
Okay. New Zealand Transport Agency were satisfied with the 42A report or the response to their submission. I have no questions as a result. Anyone else have any questions? If not, we'll move on to the next one. Silver Fern Farms. And Silver Fern Farms also supports the recommendations of the 42A report, particularly those bits around the uniform urban form and development.
On page 2, where they have the table of the recommendations, the one for UFD Objective 8, the reference is incorrect. It should be referring to submission 40.017.
So instead of 016, it should be 017.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that, Keith. Brings us to the telco companies. Chorus, Connexa, Aotearoa Towers, trading is 40 South, NZ 1 Limited, Spark, and others. Their interest was about reverse sensitivity, national planning instruments, and they accepted or their any changes that are mentioned in the 42A report in response are minor, and I have no questions of the submitter as a result.
In the bullet point for UFD Objective 1, you see the number 33056 is there twice. The second one should be referring to submission 32056.
32, I've got 32057. Yes.
No, so in the UFD 1,
Oh, yes. Yep.
33056 is twice.
Right.
One of them should be a 32.
The first one or the second one?
Doesn't matter.
Right. No questions there from me. And that finishes the list of submitters that we have on that section of general plan provisions, introduction chapters, and urban formal development.
Oh, so you didn't address the dock and the HNZBT?
Apparently they didn't wish to be heard. Okay, we'll go back and...
So they'd just sent in an email saying we're not doing anything for the hearing.
in DOC and New Zealand Heritage, wasn't it?
Yeah.
They didn't say they accepted the 42A report, it's just we're not doing anything, if I read it right.
That's definitely the case with DOC. And we've got this point that's been left hanging in terms of no more information come through from Heritage New Zealand.
Yeah, they responded later saying we're not sending anything.
So at
Which
that
leaves
point,
the issue potentially to be addressed later in the hearing in relation to what they're signalling around the management of archaeological sites as being a significant area on Stony Creek is what they were highlighting. And so we might presume potentially that more will come through in later hearing.
In later hearings, yes. Yes.
yes, when we get to those chapters on
Yeah.
archaeological sites. Right, that completes this initial grouping of submissions to the start of the plan and start of the process. Now, I understand the form now is to refer to Matt for more information. Would that be correct, Keith?
Yes, and I'm just wondering, an orderly way through might be to deal with a section of his report in each part, and there's all the preliminary material, which is consideration of our framework of decision making and other documents that in part was mirrored by the legal submissions that we've had as well. So I'm just wondering if there's any questions that the panel might have on the first, I was going to say 23, on the first 28 pages. We can probably deal with them in a block. Which is the executive summary, the introduction, the report overview, statutory requirements, and I guess even the background and hearings, which would take us up to page 31. So I don't know if panel members have got any questions right up to that part before we get into the meaty bit.
I have no questions.
Glenys?
I have no questions.
Okay. You okay, Maria, up to that point? Good. So then, that's 31. Consideration of submissions. Whether there's any questions on that as well. Which is from page 30 through to 37. So that's all of, yeah.
I've got no questions.
Just one thing, paragraph 108, and Matt yesterday corrected paragraph 98, and then paragraph 108 refers to me as the chair of policy committee. We're doing delegations under this process. It's as chair of the hearing panel.
What's that particular part? Delegated.
Yeah, so my delegations were done as chair of the hearing panel, not through the committee, chair of committee. Then we've got the hearing stream 1 submission point starts on page 35, and I'm just wondering whether we just go through almost before we get into the meaty bit, which is up to page about 40, whether there's anything people got questions on there. Matt, at your 145A, did you correct yesterday the submission numbers? Can't remember if that was my note or yours.
That's correct. So 137008 should be 138008, as
Yep.
well as 137001, 0011. Sorry.
And in the next paragraph, 146A, the submission point number should have been 68001.
Correct.
Right. My next one will come up at page 49. So if anyone's got questions up to there.
Yeah, I just have one question. I'm not sure, Matt, Keith, you may have an answer. There's further consultation with Stony Creek Station. When are we going to receive some the outcome of that further consultation?
So the intention would be to bring that back ahead of the outstanding natural landscape and biodiversity chapter, which is early next year. So we anticipate continuing discussions with them over that period.
So I imagine we'll receive a submission at that point from that submitter. Now, that will kick off a process where other people can submit or respond to their submission. Other people, and I would expect in the rural area who are similarly affected or have got similar concerns. So that will mean that those issues will be quite fully discussed or considered.
That's correct. People that have made a further submission or a similar submission in relation to those issues will have scope to present evidence at the hearing.
Now, those people that are going to be made aware of that response, will that be only confined to those who have already submitted and expressed an interest, or does it go generally to everybody?
In terms of this process, it's people that are involved in this process. Yeah.
Paragraph 185, there's a little correction there, submissions 126. The second number shouldn't be 185, it's 115.
That's correct.
Right. My next one's going to be on page 59 at 224. If anyone's got anything before, speak up. So paragraph 224 puts forward an alternative proposal saying reference to natural character could be provided for in the index to the plan. It's expressed as an idea. Is that your recommendation?
I think that's a way to ensure that we're consistent with the national planning standards, which require a chapter on natural character. And so what Southland District Council have done is just noted the reference in the document, in the plan, and said this is further outlined in other chapters.
So does that need to go into the text somewhere then?
That's correct. That would go in the index to the plan, and also I'm not sure exactly where.
I'll add it to the list of things to come back on,
Yeah,
if you like.
logically, that would go in the Part 2 district-wide matters
Okay.
under the natural environment values.
I just want to go back to the bottom of page 47. There was discussion by, well, both Greenbrier and Groundswell, they are probably Feds as well, actually, about existing use rights, and I think we had some discussion over that. I'm anticipating that we're going to have another wee look at that. Will that be driven by a direction to the reporting officer? Right,
Yes.
so you'll go away and come back with an amended approach in response to those submitters, which we will consider and then discuss. That's the way it works.
Yes.
Thank you.
Before we move along too far further, I wouldn't mind having a conversation around the submission of Mr. Coburn and Ms. Campbell, and both of them are pointing towards, well, Mr. Coburn's very specific in terms of pointing towards,
Parent number, please.
so that was, hang on, I'm just going to find it again. I want to say it. Yeah, so he's at 164, and then the assessment is a lot further down. And the assessment of Ms. Campbell, or the introduction of what her concerns are is 156, and then that's further assessed down at 179, and Mr. Coburn is assessed. Gotta find him again, right near the bottom. And I just wouldn't mind having just a bit of a conversation, because those submitters seem to be pointing, Mr. Coburn in particular, pointing towards certain types of design solutions. And so the assessment in relation to what Mr. Coburn's pointing towards just seemed a little bit light, and I thought it would be good to have a conversation around how you see those type of stormwater design solutions fitting in. And I think what they're asking for, I'm picking up that they're asking for some additional emphasis.
Sorry, can you just give me the paragraph where Mr. Coburn's assessment is discussed?
Well, I think that's the issue I've got, is I think I'm right that it might be 194 if I'll just go back up and get his submission number. No. I'll do a Control F. Yeah, so I think my issue is that I couldn't see assessment back to his submission point 152.002, so it's,
So I've found it at paragraph 194.
yeah, so I thought it was 194, but it's, as I say, quite a light touch, so I thought it would be important to have that conversation.
So if you look at the top of page 51, you'll see that I've footnoted all the references at the bottom of 51.
Yep.
Where a low impact design is referenced already in the plan.
Right.
Yeah.
Surely it's not the panel's a job to recommend an engineering solution, particularly when he's made the point that he wants best stormwater management practice, because over the life of the plan, standards are going to change, technology is going to change. Would we need to be very careful as to what we recommend?
I think that's why those rules that are all covered in the footnote at the bottom of page 51, those are matters of discretion that need to be considered through a resource consent process. So that allows some flexibility for a council engineer, for example, to be involved in those discussions. Yeah.
Just another cut at that. Outside the plan, but when there's major works being undertaken, which would occur in the annual plan, there would be an opportunity for somebody who had a preference to a particular engineering solution would have their input there, surely?
So engineering solutions are managed a number of ways. You've got the engineering code of practice, or the land management code of practice, which is managed through a bylaw process. We've brought some provisions across, particularly relating to earthworks and transport, because of the issues I talked about yesterday with those not being implemented particularly effectively under the bylaw. But there are other provisions in the bylaw that relate to stormwater that could be considered through a review of the bylaw. If it's a council project, so say council's putting in a stormwater pond to deal with stormwater management, then I'd imagine that would be a project in the annual plan that certainly the council could have input on in terms of whether they fund it or not.
Yeah.
So the low impact design elements, or these rules that you're pointing to, perhaps we can pick up as we go through the hearing. And I think it's, what I was picking up from these submitters was around moving towards certain approaches that that are less reliant on pipes and hard infrastructure, and working more with permeability and contouring and such like. So what I was picking up was it was around a sort of a design principle. Yeah, low impact design is, I guess, what you've summarised it as.
Yes.
And so perhaps the appropriate thing to do is, as we go through, and thank you for highlighting the footnote, as these rules come up, we can explore further. I just wanted to have this conversation with you in this hearing, so that these, because I saw that all of Ms. Campbell's submission points were rejected, but when I was reading nature-based solutions, I was sort of like coupling it in my mind with what was coming through from Mr. Coburn, and I think it's just important that we that conversation is visible and maintains a visibility as we go through. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's I don't know if it's an issue, but it's a focus of this hearing is really we're trying to deal with the high level submission points that don't specifically land anywhere in the plan. But as you get to those detailed topics, you can potentially come back and revisit this.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But I take your point in terms of Ms. Campbell's submission in not having a definition for nature-based solutions or clarity around what that might be talking about.
Yes.
Yeah. But when I was reading those two, I could see some alignment in what they were pointing towards. Yep.
You made reference to, I guess, the lack of staff resources to administer the provisions of the bylaw. Surely that is not a consideration for us. We are considering the framework, and in the same way the court assumes that people will act illegally, I'm expecting that we should assume that the council makes resources available to do the necessary policing or other consideration of not only what's in the district plan and enforcement, but also bylaws.
That's correct. I guess what I'm highlighting is that the environmental issue that the current approach raises, because I'm part of the process is to look at the options and weigh them up, my view is that managing particularly earthworks and transport matters through the district plan is more effective and efficient.
Managing earthworks and
Transport.
paragraph 180, referred to different rules will be established, and the date of the 4th of August 2023 comes up in full, Roman numerals 3 and 4. I'm assuming that was the date the plan was notified.
I think it's actually was the 31st of August in the end. I think when we drafted this, we were anticipating it being notified earlier.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a legal issue that given that the plan wasn't notified on that date that came later, whether in fact we're able to change that date as a minor matter. So that's part one of the question. Part two is those rules I don't think are in effect yet, and therefore they can, should the date be changed to the later to the date decisions are issued. So two points there. Can we change the date to the date it was notified, and does that date need to be changed later when decisions are issued?
I might deal with some of that first. That relates to a policy, so it's not a rule. So the rules have immediate legal effect because they relate to biodiversity, which is a section 6, or it's covered in the part of the Resource Management Act that identifies which rules have immediate legal effect. So that's, yeah, so it's not it doesn't relate to a rule, it's a policy, yeah. So I don't think immediate legal effect is such a consideration. And the second question in relation to can we amend the date, I might leave that over to legal advice.
Kia ora. So to the extent that I understand it would be changed with minimal implications on interested parties, so I don't understand there would be any impact on people as a result of that change, then I would see it as a clause 16 matter, unless there was some type of implications for the community or people in terms of their consents or other processes, then it might need to be considered further.
Sorry, I just need to, I've just recalled something. The 4th of August is when the NPSIB became effective. So I just need to check whether that relates to that date or the operative date of the district plan. It also arises in bullet 3, just above. That date's also referenced there.
All right, we're up to the list of things to report back on. My next one's at 253. Does anyone got anything prior to that?
Yes. I may well be drifting into the area where the panel might do some deliberations in private, but I do have a background question, and I want it to be noted in the minutes, I guess. Paragraph 202, Greenbrier, along with others, and I quote them, talking about supporting other industries such as mining, quarrying, and the provision of resilient infrastructure, include reference to they require the ongoing success of agriculture is underpinned by other activities in the community, and that was, I guess, similar direction taken by Groundswell, Federated Farmers, and others. Now, I note Royal Forest and Bird have a slightly less robust take on that statement, and would agree that agriculture is the predominant activity, but felt that to acknowledge the economic benefits wasn't necessary to mention as such, but went on to say that they wanted to recognise the enhancement of biodiversity where possible. My question to you, Matt, is the two things aren't mutually exclusive, are they? The economic drivers of agriculture within this district and the provision of enhancement of biodiversity, those two things are not mutually exclusive.
No, not necessarily. It depends on how you manage those things.
I accept that. So I would suggest that is it a question?
Or is it deliberation?
Or a statement.
I'm gonna find a question. The panel wouldn't be out of scope to mention the economic benefits of agriculture and associated industries, would it? if they choose to in the deliberations.
No, that's correct. I guess the point I'm making in response to that submission, which is on at paragraph 204, is
Three.
that my view is that because it's talking about an outcome and objectives are where you talk about outcomes, I'm saying that's already addressed in the UFD 10, which talks about the importance of rural production, rural industry, primary production and rural industry.
It still wouldn't be a disadvantage to mention it, though, would it? It wouldn't be contrary to any provision in the plan or...
I think the point is it's okay to mention it, it's just where the appropriate place is in the plan. Yeah.
Fair enough, thank you.
So I'd like to pick up on this because when I look at the description of the district, and in particular the final paragraph and the second sentence of the final paragraph. So I'm looking at your Appendix A, and I'm looking at page 5,
35?
and I'm looking at the final paragraph, not the note, and the second sentence. So the first sentence, page 5 of Appendix A, and it's the final paragraph of the description of the district and the second sentence. So the first sentence reads, the dominant land use is, oh no, so it's the third sentence. It notes the dominant land use and then large agribusiness in the rural sector. Then the third sentence begins, there are many other activities which also occur in the district which need to be recognised and provided for. That, I felt, was not a very helpful sentence, there are many other activities, and where you've got submitters wanting a nudge or acknowledgement of their activity, it might be a place to address that point. I think it might provide a bit of extra balance in the description of the district to add in some colorisation perhaps of what those other activities might be, and where you've got submission points that are asking for their activity to have a note in there. I wondered if that was the place to respond to that. Potentially.
That might be the place. We just need to check the scope of their submissions, because I've assumed, and it could be because I've looked at the scope of their submission, that they wanted something added into the overview of the urban form and development chapter.
Right.
Yeah, so you'll see on my page 35,
Yep.
I've added a sentence in at the end about primary production, agriculture, productivity of rural land, etc. So I would need to check whether changing that is within the scope of the submission, or whether potentially it could be a consequential
Yeah, that's
change.
kind of what I'm wondering is, I guess this is scene setting, and the scene setting occurs in different parts of this introductory part of the plan. Yeah. I think it goes to what I was noting yesterday in my conversation with Hokanui around, I've got a few things where around that cohesion and consistency and all the rest of it. And this might fall into that category as well, depending on how you how things land and other, as you say, you were pointing to the overview just then of the UFD. And what I was wondering, for these kind of things, in the same way that I'm going to put something together for response from Hokanui, and maybe do the same thing for yourself. Yeah.
Right.
I tend to take the attitude and recognise that when particularly lay people are lodging submissions to a plan, it's the outcome they're looking for, not necessarily the exact spot that they're looking at. And given that the submission point is of a general nature, I believe we've got the flexibility to add something where we see appropriate and tends to fit best.
Maybe I'll get a response to this or not, or getting back to the economic influence of certain activities in the district. Yes, you're right. People are talking about the outcome, but I think the submitters and the several of them are also concerned to preserve the right to provide that continued economic benefit to the wider community. Whereas the opposition to that acknowledgement was two submitters who are have got statutory powers, but not necessarily on a national level. And I have to say Oh, is there a question? Yes, Matt, is there a question? How do we weight submissions to submitters who live and operate within the district against submitters who possibly are a little bit more remote? Is the plan for those submitters and residents who reside in this district and are going to operate under the plan? And do we weight them ahead of those who are perhaps more remote? Sorry for the hard question.
And there might be a legal component to this, but in my view, you need to treat submitters equally and weigh up the arguments in terms of the Resource Management Act.
Thank you, Matt.
I was just going to add, as someone who lives in the district, I support 203 about enhancing biodiversity.
You support it or you don't?
Well, I believe that it should be, no, on the same level as, well, we should be looking at
The next one. Are we ready to move on then?
By all means, we can move on.
So my next one's at 257. So I think a brace of blasting Matt talked about yesterday, or I raised yesterday. So it's, am I right? It's currently a definition in the plan. There was a submission supporting it, and your recommendation, I think, was to delete it. And I think yesterday we agreed that that is actually a clause 16 matter, because it wasn't in the scope of their submission. Given that it's not dealt with in the plan, then it could come out as a minor change. And there was also dry blasting or wet.
And wet, both.
Yes, yeah, so all those, because they're not in the plan, can come out under clause 16.
That's my view. There might be a legal view on that.
Apologies, the sound didn't come through very well on that one. Can you repeat that?
Yep, so we've got the terms abrasive blasting, wet
Wet and dry blasting.
yeah, wet and dry blasting. It's not referred anywhere in the plan, so I saw it as a clause 16 matter that we can delete it as a minor matter. Yep.
no one's interested, potentially, then I would see it as a clause 16 matter. So that's the test. Is it administrative, and or is there any potential impact?
Well, we did have submitters who were supporting its inclusion, but given that there's no rules, it doesn't apply to anything. Does that change your view?
Well, then it would seem to be a submission that the panel would need to make a decision on to accept or reject.
So and I'm at page 257. So just to set the scene correctly, we have a definition in the plan that Federated Farmers supported. The 42A report rejected that submission on the basis that abrasive blasting appears nowhere else in the plan other than the definitions, and recommended that it be deleted. So it wasn't within the scope of the submission lodged, but given that it is of zero impact, that's why I saw it as a clause 16 matter.
That's a tricky one. I would think it would put it on the table for the panel to consider whether or not to keep it or not. Did the council make a further submission at all?
No.
Okay. Can I address that in the response, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
My next one's at 277. So this is a submission by the Hokanui Runanga that's been accepted in part by making reference to the promotion of renewable energy resources. And the note I've got here is that I felt it actually went beyond the scope of the submission that was lodged.
Sorry, can I get the paragraph number again?
277. So the submission itself is referred to as 273, supporting Greenbrier for the addition there. Now, I might be wrong, but I didn't think renewable energy resources came up at all in the original submission from Greenbrier. That's right, because Hokanui says they support the submission in part, noting the overview doesn't identify renewable energy. So they've raised renewable energy as a further submission, not as an original submission. So you're relying on a further submission to make in addition to the plan, not the original submission. Is that valid, I guess is the question?
I think we might need to check that in detail in the right of reply as well. There may be other submission points.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
I'd suggest to the extent that the Greenbrier submission broadens it and then Hokanui brings it back in terms of one particular point relating to renewable energy, perhaps it's not a bolt-on onto Greenbrier so much as a refinement of the point.
Okay, I'll add it to the list just to make sure. The next one's at 297. And we had a discussion that 297 refers to protecting secondary flow paths. And the comment said that ES sought additional provision to recognise stormwater capacity, and it's rejected as the detailed strategic objectives in the plan and is already dealt with in general terms in UFD Objective 1.5. And I was just questioning whether in fact that the concept of the secondary flow paths is actually reflected in that. My read of both the 41A report is that it didn't fully understand the concept of secondary flow paths. So a secondary flow path really to me is what happens when there's an extremely heavy rain and your normal waterways don't cope with it. It's not flooding, but when you look at an example on a farm, when there's heavy rain you get little riverlets forming, and it does happen in urban areas as well, that those little riverlets that run through residential areas can cause issues as well. It may well be it's an issue for subdivision consent, but whether there should be something here,
In my view, it turns on how detailed you want to be in a strategic objective. And as I note, UFD 01.5 deals with natural hazards, so it's a question as to whether an overland flow path, which is as a result of a rain event, would be considered a natural hazard. So I guess, you know, that's the point. We've got to remember these are strategic objectives which are providing general direction to the plan. The detail around water management will be dealt with in things like, particularly if it relates to subdivision, in the subdivision chapter. If it is a natural hazard, it would be dealt with in the natural hazards chapter at a lower level, if you like.
so it may well be if there are no submissions dealing with in subdivision, that this might give us some scope to actually put something there, and can make a note. I'll make a note of to check on that
Are
later.
you also indicating, when you say lower level, do you kind of mean policy, like you're dropping down to a policy level?
Probably objectives and policy at the zone or citywide level.
Right.
Because I guess this is a theme that's coming through. The district plan needs to give effect to national policy and the regional policy statement. We've got a strategic chapter that also needs to give effect to those but guide other chapters. If you get too specific in the strategic chapter, you've got nothing left to say in the objectives at the zone or citywide level. I guess the other thing that this chapter does is it provides the link between those chapters. So say you're in the rural zone, it's telling you all about what needs to happen in the rural zone. This chapter is talking about what needs to happen across the zones. So it's more of a strategic level, high level direction, rather than getting into, say, the detail of an overland flow path.
Right, and if we're thinking of the overland flow path as both natural hazard management and stormwater management, as we go into those different zones, we can think about how this point that's been brought forward might be addressed in each of those settings. Is that what you're suggesting?
It's correct, and I'm just having a quick look at the definition of natural hazard, which is included in the plan, which effectively comes from the Resource Management Act. And it says means any atmospheric or earth or water related occurrence, including a range of things which includes flooding, but it's not an exclusive list. So water related occurrence could be a secondary flow path. The action of which adversely affects or may adversely affect human life, property, or other aspects of the environment. So it's quite a broad, natural hazards is quite a broad definition.
Thank you.
And in some respects, does that relate to your response around natural character in terms of that is dealt specifically within each zone setting rather than the chapter approach, which was, this is applying a similar logic?
That's correct. I think natural character, you know, if you look at the planning standards, we should have a chapter about natural character, but natural character plays out across a number of areas in the plan. And so what Southland District have done is they've got a placeholder natural character chapter which tells you where you need to go in the plan, and that's what I'm recommending in relation to that, because particularly the strategic chapter and maybe the city-wide chapters where natural character would fit go across the whole district potentially.
And so you've just mentioned the national planning standards, so I think it's worth just having a momentary pause, because of course there are, it's dictating where things fall in what order, and but also provides opportunity for some things to be there and some things to be left out. And so is it also that you are relying on the ability to, it's not compulsory that there is a natural character chapter. If there was one, it would be there in a particular position. It's not compulsory that we have one, therefore.
If my understanding is, if you have natural character, you need a chapter on it.
Yep.
Okay. So, and Dero's natural character values within Gore, those values are articulated across a number of chapters at the moment. So, rather than duplicating across the plan, you could have a placeholder natural character chapter that directs you to other parts of the plan. I think part of the issue is if you did have a natural character chapter, it's likely only to include objectives and policies, and you'll have to go to other parts of the plan to look at the relevant rules. And so the most efficient way to deal with that, in my view, is to take the Southland District Council approach, which has a placeholder heading, and because you have to have a heading that says natural character, but it's you can go to other parts that can direct you to other parts of the plan.
So thinking about what you just said around it might not have any rules and it might only have objectives and policies, in that respect, it would have a similar, like if there was one and that was true, it would be of a similar nature to this UFD strategic direction chapter.
Slightly. The strategic direction only has objectives because that's the requirement in the National Planning Standards. If you were going to have a specific natural character chapter, then it would likely have objectives and policies.
Necessary?
I need to check the planning standards because they do they do articulate what you have to have at different layers.
Yes, and I think that's what I'm getting at, just being cautious around certainty that we're, in our decision making, meeting the requirements of the standards. Yeah.
That leads us on to the objectives of the urban form and development chapter. The various questions I had on objective 1 have all been responded to over discussions yesterday. Did anyone else have any questions remaining on objective 1? So the next objective is objective 4. And at paragraph 325, Ministry of Education supported and had asked for, supported objective 4 and asked for educational to be added, and the recommendation at 327 was to refer to Appendix B. It should have been Appendix A, shouldn't it?
No, Appendix B is where the submission points are individually gone through and recommendations are recorded.
Okay, so if it's submitter
Submitter 125.
then it's on page near 80 something, I guess. Oh no, here we are. So you've got except in part. So what change has happened to objective 4?
I think the point I'm raising there is what they're asking for is already generally covered in other objectives. So in terms of changing that objective, effectively it is rejecting what they're seeking. But what I'm highlighting is that what they're asking for is broadly covered in other objectives.
Okay, so you're not adding then educational as requested there, or in objective 5. Which is on page 79, what they asked for.
No, what I'm saying, you're correct, but what I'm saying is that objective 4 relates to centres typically, and education facilities aren't solely located in centres. And objective 01 talks about social infrastructure, which would include educational facilities.
Okay, so in terms of objective 05, I guess the point I was picking up reading through that is that when you look at the town centre, you're not talking about the town centre zone, but the whole of, I guess, the inner urban area of Gore, for example, or Mataura, because there are no schools in the town centre zones.
That's correct. So the Gore Town Centre, the Mataura Local Centre, they're mapped.
Right,
So, yeah.
so yes, it's the specific areas.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had, thank you. Whether there's anybody else who has any other questions?
I just want to go back to the potential for additional submissions resulting from the additional consultation of Stony Creek. So there may well be, or there will be, new evidence presented from those submitters, supporting or contrary. That may well include reference to forestry.
Yes, that's correct. So there,
And different types of forestry?
potentially, I think the hearings have been structured so that there's a wrap-up hearing at the end where if there's any integration issues, so we're talking about rural before we get to biodiversity and landscape, for example. If there's things that come up in the biodiversity and landscape topic that mean we need to go back and revisit the rural chapter, because forestry is currently managed in the biodiversity and landscape areas principally, then we may need to deal with that in the wrap-up hearing at the end where those people that have made submissions that need to be revisited will have an opportunity to present evidence at that wrap-up hearing.
We had people submit yesterday about forestry and all its variation, but hadn't mentioned it in their initial submission. So they are outside, they are wanting to introduce new evidence in effect through their variable summary, and that potentially was going to provide or present the panel with an issue, but that may be resolved with this further evidence, potentially with further submissions, which these parties may well be comment on.
I think if you can be a bit more specific about which party you're thinking about.
I'll go Federated Farmers, for example. They were discussing carbon farming.
Carbon farming.
And their
I think that was because the panel had asked them about that, because an earlier submitter had raised that issue. So you'd need to look at whether that's within the scope of their submissions.
I don't think it was, but further discussion from the wider farming community may present that opportunity again. And it would be acceptable, even though it may well be new evidence or tighter clarification of some aspects of an activity.
I think we might need to have a specific example that we can take away and get you some advice on.
Okay, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, but if there is a specific submission on carbon farming, then it will come up later.
That's correct.
It's just that I haven't found one yet.
It may well come up.
That's my point. That's yeah.
And I guess the legal response may well be, if we believe that there is a hole in the district plan provisions, we do have the ability to recommend to council that it look at doing a variation to fill that hole.
Or a plan
I might be
change.
able to assist on that point. Commissioner Bolger, you can be relatively generous for your submitters attending to provide information in support of their submission, but you also need to be aware of the fact that the paper submission or the document that was submitted gave the community notice on what issues they were likely to address. So that then goes back to the submissions that were made in writing, which summarises that it needs to be generally able to be understood as being within scope of what that party would speak to. So if they're document that was filed had no reference to that point, then it may be that there isn't sufficient scope, and it might need to be dealt with as Commissioner Hobell suggested.
Thank you. I think that is the case. Thank you for your clarification. Any questions from anybody else?
So a lot of my questions weren't specific to going through the Section 42A report. They're sort of other things to test. And as a result of sort of going through the definitions and things like that. So some of which, as I've said, might be similar to the dialogue with Hokonui.
Can I just clarify, because I think some definitions have been dealt with in hearing stream 1, other definitions have been allocated to other hearings where
Yes.
they're most relevant.
And that was something that I wanted to work through and check. Are we going to pick this one up
Yeah.
here? You know, I
Sure.
just kind of need to do that exercise a little bit.
I'll do my best, because there's 5,500 submission points and I can't necessarily remember exactly what topic they've ended
That's
up in.
okay. So my questions are of this. So if I start with one, where we've got an RPS definition for something, how have the definitions been arrived at is probably part of my question. So was there an exercise of looking to what was sitting in the RPS? So the one that came up yesterday was regionally significant infrastructure, I think. But, you know, obviously the RPS that we have to give effect to has some definitions in it. To what extent have they been pulled through? And where they haven't been pulled through, is there a reason for that? Were there any differences between them?
Yeah, I can't give you a definitive answer on all the definitions, but what I would say is typically we've used, depending on the timing of it, a national policy statement definition or a national planning standard definition, because they post-date the RPS.
Mm-hmm.
So the RPS, I think, was 2017.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously we've used national planning standard definitions because we have to in those situations. So, but we have looked at the RPS in developing the relevant chapters and associated definitions. Does that generally answer your question without a specific example?
No, that's good.
No?
That's good. And so, because we did talk about critical infrastructure, regionally significant infrastructure, do we need regionally significant infrastructure or nationally significant infrastructure to be defined because it is nested under the critical infrastructure definition but is not defined?
I think we'll need to look at that, because there's also guidance on that in national policy as well as RPS, in terms of how we manage nationally significant infrastructure.
Yeah, so in the dialogue yesterday with Transpower, Ms McLeod was indicating, yep, we'd ordinarily see a definition for regionally significant or nationally significant, or it wouldn't be unusual to see that. And so it does leave this question for me as to was there any reason we don't have one of either? And if the answer is that it would be more useful for plan users to have that visible in the plan, and if there are definitions sitting in RPS or MPS or National Planning Standards that it might be good to make those visible. Yeah,
I think that'll probably get played out more in the infrastructure
yeah,
hearing,
EIT,
and we
yeah.
may need to come back up to the urban form and development chapter and revisit, depending on, if we have a new definition of regionally significant infrastructure, let's say, because of the discussion in the infrastructure chapter, we may need to come back up and adjust the urban form and development objectives to acknowledge regionally significant infrastructure. But if you make a call at the infrastructure hearing that actually the critical infrastructure definition captures everything sufficiently, then we may not need to come back and revisit.
yep.
Yeah.
So-
You also might, even if you don't change the definition, you might need to revisit how it's framed in the urban form and development chapter.
Something I found that didn't come through as yet was, do we need a definition for residential catchment? When I was reading definitions that were relying on a reference to residential catchment, it left a hanging question for me in terms of interpretation. It's not, is that readily understood what that is?
Sorry, can you point me to where residential catchment's used?
Yep. Just one moment. It's in the definition, so it's not in your appendix, so sorry, I'll have to go to a different location. So in the local centre zone, there's an example, a description of the zone includes areas used predominantly for a range of commercial activities and community activities that service the needs of the residential catchment. And then in UFD 05.2, the Mataura Local Centre provides for a range of commercial activities and community activities that serve the needs of the surrounding residential catchment.
So that those definitions largely reflect what's in the national, it's either the National Policy Statement Urban Development or the National Planning Standards. And they're trying to differentiate between centre types.
Yep.
So, for example, a city centre in an urban setting like Auckland serves a regional catchment. And then you've got town centre, you've got metropolitan centre which serves a sub-regional catchment. Then you've got a town centre that serves, I can't quite remember the phrasing, but it's not the surrounding residential area, it's a wider area. So you're moving down the hierarchy. So it's more of a descriptive term, and it's about the general area that those centres serve. So I don't necessarily think you need a definition, because you can refer to the NPSUD, I think it is, to get a sense of that, how that hierarchy is defined.
Okay.
So it's really just a bit of context about, so this is a neighbourhood centre in the case, and we've also got neighbourhood centres in Gore. They're serving the immediate catchment around them, as opposed to the wider residential catchment.
So I'm just, while you're there, before we move off that point. Stupid thing.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to jump in briefly. I've got Peel, would you mind making a note of any other legal issues that I'll need to address in the further questions?
Yep, I can record those.
Thank you. Thank you, panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it doesn't specifically come up in the MPSUD. I just did a little check, but what you're saying is that there are standard practices associated that can be drawn upon to readily understand what that means. So good as gold.
I think I can take that away and find exactly where it is. It might be in the planning standards then, which describe, it's
think
not in
the-
the
the-
definitions, it's in a,
Yeah, the context is quite clear though.
yes,
I think in the context that the wording is fine, and
Yes.
we probably don't need to dwell down any deeper on it.
okay, sure.
In the definition of agricultural aviation activity, it refers to aircraft and helicopters, but the definition for aircraft already incorporates helicopters. It's a small thing.
I think we'll revisit that in a later hearing. I think it might be the rural
Yep.
hearing.
And so a lot of this might be in the same vein. One thing that it's a broader thing that I've noticed, which is where you've got definitions, for instance, there's a lot of them in relation to historic heritage. It'll say something like modify in relation to historic heritage means. And then that's true for construction activity in relation to noise and urban area in relation to transport. Some of these terms, like modify, have broader utility. There's one of the definitions, or a couple of them actually, that say restoration in the context of historic heritage means actually, not sure if it's that one now, and in other circumstances means, but for where we've got these definitions that tie themselves to an issue like noise or historic heritage or transport, and they have potentially wider usage or meaning, restoration would be one. Do we need that corresponding aspect of the definition in each case? So if it says in the restoration in the context of historic heritage means this, restoration in other parts of the plan means this. Because it's inconsistent. Some of them do it and some of them don't. Most of them don't. So you end up with just... are you following my...
Yeah, so I take your point. So ecological restoration, for example, isn't described. It may be under ecological restoration, but yes, I see what you're saying. I guess we need to look at where those terms are used throughout the plan and determine whether they actually need a definition, or we can rely on the common English definition.
Yep.
Yep.
And it was also, I found myself, at first I was just accepting, okay, it's tied to this particular issue, and where it's silent, carry on. But then there are a couple of places where the definition actually does make the point of saying, and in other circumstances it means this. So I was just wanting to know that we're just being as clear as we can be.
I think where a term is defined, it's in italics, so that'll take you to the definitions.
Yep.
And so, for example, if restoration is used in the biodiversity chapter, for example, but it's clear what it means because it's in a policy that might help explain what that means.
And it's not italicised.
Yes, then you wouldn't go here.
Yep.
I think an example would be site, the word site,
Yeah.
or building.
Mhm.
Sometimes in a policy we're generally talking about those things, but we're not using the specific definition. That's why it's italicized and that's why you'd come here.
And we're really clear about that in the how the plan works, because now that you've said that, that's really quite important.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A basic point in terms of sometimes the definitions employ acronyms. MPSIB is the most common one, and whether there's a drafting consistency practice where in relation to definitions all acronyms would be expanded.
There is a table of abbreviations.
Yep.
So I guess the preference is to probably include them in the abbreviations, because there's a whole lot of abbreviations right through the plan.
Understood. What I guess my question is in the definitions, are we being consistent about writing things out in full or utilising acronyms? Yeah.
Okay, we can check that.
And this might be one for the transport chapter. So the roading definitions were I had some questions about those, so they might be best addressed in the transport chapter. And one aspect of my question was about the One Network framework and whether reliance on that was the correct approach, but that might be something to address in the transport chapter.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of cluster housing, I could only see that term used in relation to the Māori development special purpose zone, and that left me wondering why we weren't just using the term papakainga, because that's what it is.
I think that was a request from the Runanga who helped draft that chapter.
To have the cluster housing definition.
Yes.
Okay. The CPTED definition, it looked to me, well, the definition itself looked quite problematic in terms of being one of these explanatory ones, but also I noted that in all cases where that is used in the plan, the full name is used. So the definition itself, I noted, doesn't read like a definition, and every place that it's used in the plan, it's expanded. And so I had a real question about whether it belonged there in the definitions at all. It doesn't read like a definition, it reads like an explanation.
Yes. So in terms of where it's used throughout the plan, are you saying it doesn't say CPTED, it says crime
Yes,
prevention through
every time.
environmental design?
Correct.
Yes.
And that seemed quite appropriate to me where it's sitting.
I guess the question is, do people understand what that means? So if there's no definition of it or description, or it could be in the glossary, for example, rather than the definitions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or an advice note of some kind. At the moment, I guess it's one of these ones that looks more like an explanation than a definition.
Yes.
So it's in that category. Yep.
Yes.
This is a question that might be best dealt with in the earthworks conversation.
Can I just interrupt? There are many more, otherwise we may need to take a comfort or a brief break.
Yes, there are, and so I appreciate all of you that this is testing patience, but it really is an opportunity to sort of signal some things and work out where things are going to play out.
Yeah, I don't want to curtail you going through the list, but I think we need to take a 5-minute break for the
Very
needs
good.
of staff.
I'm just wondering if this, I think we briefly talked about getting a list from the panel that we could take away and do a formal response on. I'm wondering if that might be what's an alternative option, or whether you want to continue to tease it out here, because a lot of what I'm doing is giving you clarity about which hearing it might come up in and that sort of thing. If
Well,
there
We'll
might be,
we'll adjourn for 5 or 10 minutes, consider that and come back and give you a response.
thanks.
Thank you.